Well, Phil, my sincere apologies and
Mm,
regret have to be expressed. I was very wrong about something, and I think it's important that I get out ahead of this.
okay.
I am previously on the record saying that the second coach for Austin FC coming from the Berhalter coaching tree would be a disaster, and I was completely wrong about that. And I feel differently now, having
Okay.
actually thought about it. My
Okay.
reflexive hate for Greg Berhalter clouded my logic,
Mhm.
and I did not consider a variety of things that are why, contrary to what seems to be the popular opinion, I think this is actually a great coach hire.
This is possibly colored by Bruce Arena having been available as well.
It could have been worse. I think there are some very valid points that others have raised from a position of expertise that me from the comedian's chair, I just so happen to share some of these very well-founded opinions.
Austin FC could have been worse. The story of the first 4 years.
Emergency podcast. Better did a thing, so we gotta talk about it. Emergency podcast. It's an emergency. Emergency podcast. Shut up, hell yeah, shut up, hell yeah, shut up. Emergency podcast. It's an emergency.
Hey, a hearty hello to you all, and welcome to Emergency Podcast, the Austin FC podcast, where we talk about all the Austin FC emergencies. We have been getting a fire hose of news. We've been getting something every day this week. Monday through Thursday, we got some player renewals, and then Friday, there's a new coach. Who knew? It's Nico Estevez, who we are pretty familiar with here in Austin from having seen him coach team up the road in South Oklahoma. So let's go ahead. We're going to first talk about these player renewals and talk about that because I think there's some interesting things developing here. And then obviously the big subject is Nico Estevez. And then again, just this question about, okay, is this really the best possible hire for Austin? Is this something that we were expecting? Were the expectations set to be something else? And then what do we do with this information? And of course, I've written some things over the past few days dealing with this. I tapped a lot of people that I know up in that part of the world, that there are smart people who follow that team. You might feel differently about the fan base, but there are some really great journalists up there. So we got to feature them a little bit. And then, of course, you heard Moisés in the opening there talking about his desire to dispense of the Berhalter coaching tree altogether. And then all of a sudden, we're back. We're Berhalter in again, right? So let's go ahead and maybe, do we want to just get new initial reactions on that and then just dovetail into player renewals?
We thought about going about this one way, and I think we might end up going the reverse direction because of the fresher news. Uh,
Sure.
there are a few things that have come to mind just honestly, some of them in the last few hours of this Sunday morning as we record this,
Mhm.
following an infuriating Arsenal draw and a an
Mhm.
electrifying, fascinating Inter Juventus draw this morning, because the whole football world only revolves around my tastes. The thing that I am thinking back on that I find the most interesting is that I now wonder if the club thinks that I knew as as far back as the Roto press conference right after Josh got fired, because of questions that I asked that were completely unintentionally a little bit prescient, where I closed asking about the person to person relationship between the new coach
Yeah.
and the fan base, reset point,
Mhm.
recalibration. And
Yeah.
Roto's answer was very carefully worded about that kind of emotional intelligence being very important. And there was this kind of look on his face. And
Mhm.
I want to retroactively think that was a, how the hell did this leak? How did this leak?
Right.
How
Yeah.
does he know? And the stuff that I thought back to what I had asked off the top, and I asked specifically about MLS experience. And there was
Mhm.
similarly this kind of, I wasn't asking an aggressive question.
Right.
I wasn't twisting anything. I wasn't digging. I wasn't really going for anything. But the reaction, it wasn't over the top, but
Yeah.
there was a subtle, he was evading a question that didn't seem like it was something that needed to
Mhm.
be evaded.
Yeah.
And it turns out that, yes, as written in their press release, the MLS experience and the
Mhm.
personable relationship that he wants to have with the fan base, this
Right.
seems to very much have gone into
Mhm.
this decision. So I
Which is
don't.
interesting because people were floating Ronnie Delia and Dom Torrent as possible
Mhm.
people with both that kind of CFG experience, City Football Group, of course, and also the MLS experience. But I think there was a lot of people, myself included, who thought that they might just go for somebody young from the CFG Pantheon somewhere over in Europe, somebody who didn't necessarily have that MLS experience. That didn't maybe necessarily matter as much as getting somebody with ideas, with inspiration, what have you. But as it turns out, yeah, the MLS experience is pretty important. And again, even though this is somebody who was coaching for less time than Josh and did about as well, maybe a scooch better than Josh in terms of points per game. Again, I think that is coloring kind of the initial reactions that some fans are having to what's going on. But
Yeah.
at the same time, and we'll get into this in a little bit here, but I do want to get more of your thoughts. Some of the things that in particular John Arnold and Armin Kafai said in the article that I put up this morning gives some credence to, yeah, this is somebody who has some things in common with Josh, is friends with Josh, but is going to be a different coach and is going to offer some different things right from the jump.
This is me making it very clear that I don't have, magical inside sources or something, and I wasn't
Mhm.
asking those questions from a position of advanced knowledge. But that has also contributed to, as I had mentioned to you by text, wondering how far back they started working on this, because they obviously didn't
Mhm.
immediately start the search with no work being done, but they're not going to tell us that
Right.
the moment that Josh was dismissed. It makes me wonder how far back this started to be in the works, and at what point Rhoda was looking at this as a very
Mhm.
compatible option, and kind of like Jader Obrian, a distressed asset from Frisco that
Mhm.
he could work with. And I feel
Yeah.
like what I read into the way that his public statements are, and I'm trying to take everything at face value rather than get
Mhm.
mixed into the multiverse of trying to read between the breaths and in between the words that some people have about what is Roto lying about? He must be lying about this. Taking at face value that when he came to the club, part of the attraction to him was Josh as the coach. I stand
Mhm.
by believing that meant he saw Josh as a young coach who was worth developing, who he believed had potential. And in
Right.
the course of working with him over the last 18 months, the times that we saw the club's tactics shift in ways
Mhm.
different than what we had gotten used to setting our watches by, in terms of
Mhm.
bunkering and
Yeah.
playing defensive, but badly transitional defensive.
Getting the ball out wide, crosses into
Yeah,
the box,
there were those spring games
horseshoe. Yeah.
where suddenly they were doing adaptive pressing,
Mhm.
and they were not going all press all the time,
Yeah.
but they would see the opportunity, they would go for it. And I feel if there is trying to read the tea leaves of the way that the team performed over the course of the season, there were those glimmers of light, and then there was always this regression to the mean of what we've been used to seeing from Wolf's
Mhm.
tactics, where
Yeah.
he refuses that kind of flexibility. And what I believe follows logically about what he said about Josh and what he sees in the potential with Nico is that, sure, Nico
Mhm.
is part of the Berhalter tree, but his roots come from Valencia. His roots are
Right.
Valencian, and this isn't just a good old boy network kind of thing. He
Although that
has,
doesn't hurt.
it doesn't hurt, but that he has that European big club mentality that
Mhm.
somebody who mostly played the latter portion of their senior career in MLS, and who
Yeah.
has been in MLS, not as a coach, but in MLS for a much larger portion of their career. I think that
Yeah.
MLS is very bubble, and it
Mhm.
contributes to getting stuck in certain ways of thinking, which is part
Yeah.
of why we see the fruit of the Berhalter tree being poisoned. I think that where he did not end up finding that flexibility and finding that interest in learning and listening and being open to being wrong with
Mhm.
Josh, I feel like he sees Nico Estevez as that opportunity, as that
Okay.
apprentice that knows that there are things that did not work at his previous post, and
Mhm.
has taken a lot of learning from that. And being hired as an assistant under Poch is for me, a sign of this is not a guy who is so loyal to Greg, a guy who he worked with, that
Mhm.
he, would not work under a men's national team regime that is the one immediately following Greg getting fired.
Yeah.
Like that's a piece of this too, is he is not a Greg
Mhm.
Berhalter loyalist in the ways that
Mhm.
other options that came from within that clutch came. And
Mhm.
that's the reality of US soccer is for a while, a whole lot of stuff. If you wanted to get a job in the States, a lot of those jobs were necessarily connected to Greg Berhalter, whether you liked him or not, whether you liked his particular iteration of Total Football or not. That's that's where my head's at on this and why I'm
Yeah.
honestly very optimistic about this. And I think there's a lot of
Mhm.
potential. There are notes for concern, of course.
Okay. Yeah. I think it's interesting though. Again, we don't know like how long this has been developed, but it is curious that the very day that Josh Wolf gets dismissed, Nico just happens to be at Palmer Field with the rest of the US
Yeah.
coaching staff. It's maybe coincidental, but I feel like there was maybe a conversation or two while Nico was in town that Roto was able to have to maybe move this along a little bit. I don't think this happened in 3 weeks. I definitely
Hmm.
think that he was doing some calling around. I think he was probably doing some kind of investigating beforehand. Again, it's got to be a little bit sensitive because of the relationship that Wolf and Estevez have and this friendship. And obviously, they know each other as coaches, and mildly awkward maybe to have one succeed the other. But at the same time, it's as we've talked about, this is a good opportunity. And versus FC Dallas, where there might be like a reticence to spend to a certain degree, although Peter Musa, they certainly spent a lot of money for. But a lot of the model for FC Dallas before, and this is changing a little bit, but was definitely kind of academy based and thinking about developing talent. They do have some players that they've gone after, but they don't maybe necessarily have kind of the level of ambition that, say, an Inter Miami or LAFC does. Not that many teams
Hmm.
do, but it is, we know the kind of players that Austin's going to go after, and we know what kind of energy the fan base brings. And we know that it does still really have a potential to be a good MLS city. But again, this whole kind of question of what level of ambition does this coaching hire show? And is are Burrell and Estevez going to be able to create something together that is that kind of true partnership that we thought Burrell and Wolf might have? Or some are speculating this might be a way station to another coach. I don't know if that really makes sense. I don't know that's necessarily the plan. I think Burrell is thinking this guy is good and wants to see what he's going to be able to do over, I would expect, like at least a 2 to 3 year window to prove what he can prove. It is interesting, though. Again, and I know this is going to come up on Tuesday, if not you asking, somebody else asking. But again, just this idea of you set these expectations over here, names you wouldn't believe, etc. And now we have, essentially MLS coaching carousel. And I think with the step, it's a little bit different because of that Valencia background and all that. But it does still feel like, to a certain degree, okay, this is a coach going from one MLS team missing the playoffs in 2024 to another that is in that same situation.
Yeah. You mentioned Peter Musa, and that makes me want to circle back around to a thought that came to
Okay.
mind looking at some of the stuff that John Arnold said and others, where
Hmm.
Peter Musa, incredible player,
Hmm.
playmaker, really solid. But when they brought Peter Musa in,
Hmm.
that required changing their tactics around a single player acquisition, and the tactics, the way that they had been working, were working pretty well. And so
Hmm.
the allusions that have been made to Nico never quite worked with that front office, there's an indication that there was a butting of heads in some
Hmm.
ways. And I feel like what that says to me, not being inside that rumor mill, is that there was some sort of a butting of heads between the sporting
Hmm.
department and their head coach, where it was, this is the kind of team that we're building, make it work, rather than the kind of two-way communication that is, if you bring in a guy that is that good, admittedly, and
Hmm.
it costs that much, then I have to completely rework my entire system around one guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And here's why that doesn't help. Okay, too
Hmm.
bad, tough, we're buying him. And
Hmm.
that's what's happening. That's the headcanon I create out of what I have heard and what I have seen written about the point where there was suddenly a decline. And yes, I'm taking something out of a press release from the club, but that year over year improvement of 20 points is nothing to scoff at.
In his first season, yeah.
In his first season. That is honestly tantamount to Brett Utley winning a championship in a third division developmental league in the first season of not just coaching them, but of that third division team's existence. That is something that shows some pretty sharp coaching acumen, whether it is maybe you are blessed with some great players, but a lot of it is keeping their mentality where it needs to be. In Utley's case, he played the majority of those playoffs on the road, and he kept those young guys who are all prone to disciplinary cards and so on. He kept all their heads in the right space. And there's such a thing as people will talk about the firing the coach bounce. There isn't always that new coach bounce. We've seen the struggle at Nashville. We've seen struggles in other teams around the league. That is an uncommon thing that I don't think should be poo-pooed as well. Finding excuses for why it isn't a big deal. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of nuance to this that I am assuming I would be shocked, frankly, if a whole lot of prep has not gone into this is why this was the choice. This is why this is the choice over the names that would not be believed, because the names that would not have been believed, maybe some of them, their conditions were, look, my contract is up months from now, so use an interim and you can have me in the summer. Or it was just not the right kind of fit for what was needed. And frankly, as weird as people outside of the MLS bubble would think that it is, MLS experience, because of it being a salary cap league, because of it being the MLS Central Committee totalitarian one-party state, it is something that takes some adaptation. And it's something that, a sporting director can drop into and make relatively quick work of. But on the coaching side of things, coming into it directly with the European mentality of leagues with promotion and relegation, leagues with various other factors that are just not present in MLS, is much less the sort of thing that that it's easy to immediately acclimate. And with the club and the relationship with the fan base being what it is, I don't know that they could have dealt with that kind of training wheels thing. And if anything, hiring a former rival coach, there is a theme to Austin bringing in guys like Will Bruin, who was known for frustrating the Timbers as a member of the Sounders, Diego Rubio, who's played in other places across the league, and hiring the right people with the right league experience is the kind of thing that the club has a reputation of. That, sure, part of that credit goes to Josh Wolf because it was under his coaching tenure, but it's just something that is a valuable aspect of these people. And one more thing, on the note of Nico being hired as a stopgap kind of a thing for 6 months until the real guy is ready, that is a jump across the eighth dimension that Buckaroo Banzai would ask me. Like that, just that is multi-dimensional chess that strains credulity for me. Crazier things have happened, sure, but I feel like in a league where these coaches, these players, their families get rooted, they don't want to just be on a part-time stop off and jump from place to place. Alex Ring has talked about how his kids were young enough when he came to the club that they really have grown up in Austin. Driussi and other players have seemed very happy being outside of places like Russia, places like bouncing all over Europe and that kind of thing. They crave that kind of stability, and Nico Estevez is coming into this club with something to prove, in the same way that Hader Obrian did, in the same way that Brendan Hines-Ike did, that various other players that either had injury histories or just had something about them that made them seem like a sort of distressed asset or a spare part that just did not work in this system or that system. And the incentive-based thing is something that we've seen success with in the Roto era, with Brendan Hines-Ike, with various other players who have come in. Matt Hedges, there's another piece of the Frisco puzzle. That, to me, is what had me... Initially, I went, really? That guy? Because a while back, I think we may have even discussed it on the podcast, or maybe it was just a conversation we were having in the press box or something, where you said, oh, man, can't wait until Austin hires Nico Estevez to replace Josh. I swear you said that to me at one point. point. I don't know when, but it was thrown off as a joke. Of course they wouldn't do that. Why would they do that? That would be
Right.
totally insane. And at the time, I thought, that does sound insane, but he's bilingual and his coaching experience didn't begin with Greg Berhalter. And
Mhm.
like it got me to thinking that this is a guy who probably wants out from under those assumptions about who he is as a person, as a
Mhm.
coach, just as much as I'm sure Austin fans would very much hope that he does really well. And I have heard on background that the bearing of the front office, the bearing of ownership, is that they want this new coach. This was before Nico was named. They want this
Mhm.
new coach to make a serious run for MLS Cup in their first season.
Mhm.
And I feel like Nico Esteves' revenge plot is a realistic way to marry those interests, where it's not
Yeah.
just get a coach to get people to pick up their season tickets again, but it is get a
Mhm.
coach to
Right.
rally the fan base around and rally the reputation of the club around, especially going into the incredibly high visibility thing of being the MLS All-Star host for 2025.
Yeah, that's the other thing too. Yeah, that he's going to have that platform right away, which is interesting. Because again, if Josh had been allowed to coach out the rest of his contract, then he would have been in that position, which I know that some people were not fond of thinking about. So yeah, so I want to, yeah, so a couple things here. So yeah, John and Armand had given some insights about what they think that relationship's going to be like, and just that John had talked about in particular, emphasizing that he's bilingual, this idea that that's maybe not enough necessarily to motivate Driussi, but it does sound like Driussi is needing a sort of reset and having a new coach coming in who understands him, who has that kind of European experience.
Mm-hmm.
Does seem like that will be better. If it is possible, if we have not seen Driussi already peak and we're now seeing this kind of continued valley, if he is to bounce back in 2025, I think having a new coach to facilitate that is a thing that is important, is a thing that's helpful. Again, John had talked about, and Armand had talked about this too, his kind of flexibility, this kind of idea that he is willing to change tactics. That again, with Josh, we saw that happen sometimes, but then he would always kind of default to being possession based and doing those sorts of
Mm-hmm.
things. Right.
It was always a surprise when we saw it from Josh. And it's
Mhm.
something that you would see Nico actively put into play.
Yeah.
The majority of the Dallas games that I watched that he coached were the ones that he was playing against Austin, but I would catch other ones because playoff seeding and that kind of thing. And for me, it felt very much like those changes in tactics. He was so much more adaptable before the 80th minute than Josh
Yeah.
was. That was the
Right.
biggest
Right.
defining thing. Is Josh would
Yeah.
change things up 10 minutes before the end of regulation.
And it is still a weird roster when you have Jesus
Hmm.
Ferreira as your anchor player, who is not quite a nine, although he sometimes is, not quite a 10, although he sometimes is, can be a little bit challenging to try to figure out what to do within that. And again, especially with this season, with trying to integrate Musa in there, like we talked about, and just, yeah, integrating Musa, like we talked about, and just that kind of idea of trying to get a kind of traditional number nine in a system for a team that when they had that wasn't particularly successful, right? Like Frank O'Hara, he had some issues in terms of, I think, his speed, his mobility, his kind of buy-in. When you would see this kind of inconsistency from him, Musa is a much more consistent player, but also somebody who is new to this, had to be integrated. And there were kind of other things that happened with that team this year. I do want to go back. So June 29th, 2022,
Uh-huh.
I was in LA. I was covering for John, who was our striker writer for Dallas at the time. And this was actually right before the striker expanded to LA. So initially I was just covering for John and going on this LA trip, but it actually turned out to be an opportunity to meet with some of the people who were going to be staff writers and get them in. But I was still doing post-match stuff on the Dallas games. So I went down to the Angel City locker room and I interviewed Nico, and then I interviewed Jesus Ferreira. And yeah, Dan Hunt was like in there the whole time, basically in this like little tiny locker room. And it was just, yeah, it was bad. It was a 3-1 loss. They had equalized and then they gave up two second half goals, and that was pretty much it. And Nico was very thoughtful and I think gave good answers to questions, but obviously it was not fun vibes in there. And then Jesus Ferreira just does not like doing media stuff at all, and was wondering, okay, why am I doing this with this person that I like haven't really met before? And Dan was like really thankful to us for giving the coverage, because again, this is a time period where, there are not a lot of media outlets that are covering FC Dallas. There obviously there are a few people that we reached out to that are still doing good work. But yeah, but I mean, it is a tougher road to hoe in Dallas than Austin in terms of the coverage that you're getting, in terms of the competition. We do not have the Dallas Cowboys in Austin, so automatically it becomes a little bit bigger dog for Austin FC than FC Dallas. But yeah, just thinking about that whole experience, and it just seemed this kind of unhappy grind that he was in the midst of. And it's not really through the fault of any one person, but I just think situationally and all that, I think the kind of culture, the kind of energy that you have in Austin, particularly with the fan base and the joy that they bring, I think that this becomes a good reset for Nico as well. I think obviously getting dismissed mid-season is not a good way to go out. There are certainly concerns about how the tail end of his tenure went, but in the same way that this is a reset for players, I think that this does provide an opportunity for Estevez to remember his joy in this and bring that to the team and have this kind of melding of joyfulness that will hopefully get into the new season and get into a much more kind of positive, happy place. Because you remember 2024, they go to Coachella, there's optimism. We're thinking, okay, Austin's doing some things. They've got some new players. And then that game against Minnesota happens, particularly that first half happens. It was just so deflating. And I don't know that they ever really got over that, because in 22, obviously, those first two games they had were phenomenal. 5-goal wins, and all of a sudden they're off and running on the season. Of course, 2023 starts out, you have this Cascante injury and the Jared Stroud, Kip Keller mind meld, and then the defensive stuff that happened after. But yeah, you have these kind of situations where that first game can really set a tone for the season, and I think the vibes are going to be better. We still have to see how it all shakes out, the whole kind of player resets and what happens with the roster. But I do think it's an opportunity for something pretty positive. And the fact that they're going to try to get Nico to meet with fans after the press conference on Tuesday, I think is a good sign. I think it's a good gesture. I think it's something that is needed, right? There is an approachability about it, and they're going to do it at the stadium. Don't do another ridiculous, let's go to a nightclub in the daytime like they did with Josh, like they did with Bucharest. Just stick to the roots, stay in the stadium, remind everybody, yes, this is soccer. We don't have to remind people of Austin nightlife. We can just focus on, it's a team in a stadium where fans cheer, and this is where they cheer, and you get to actually meet with him.
My understanding is that the meeting with the fans has already been said that it'll be at Q2 following the press conference.
Okay,
my assumption it will be in the Real Deal press conference room. And people often will pipe up and say, oh, why don't they stream all the press conferences? And I'm like, the press conferences at St. David's are a DSLR on a tripod.
In a wind tunnel.
Yeah, in a wind tunnel. It's not the same setup as they have at the stadium. Word is that allegedly those may be moving indoors next season, and we can cross our fingers about that.
That's good.
But before we hop off of the Nico thing, the thing that I think everybody is nervous about is they got used to a lot of the same patterns. And I feel like this being the first opportunity to break from those patterns and those feelings, and giving more access to the fans.
There was a kind of meet and greet for Josh that happened immediately after, but it was at, I don't remember I think it was still Opal Divines then. It's Buford's now. It's like out on West 6th. And basically it was just like this kind of Q&A thing that they did, and it was stilted. And again, this was a thing where there's still not a team. I think Rodney was the only signing at that point. It was weird vibes. It was meeting the coach, but it felt still like it was very controlled and was very organized to present him. That it wasn't, I feel like what they're planning with Estevez, and I don't know this for sure, but it sounds like it's going to be, and I'm hoping it's the case, is like more informal, and it's just people will get to just actually talk to him and welcome him, and it's not going to be some kind of like mediated press conference-y type thing. Like, I don't think that's really what the club needs to settle on right now. I think with Josh, it was different because they were still trying to establish themselves and their identity as a club. They were still an unknown entity at that point. You still see that kind of hand guiding and the delicate release and things like that. But I do think at this point that it really just needs to be about organically reconnecting with fans,
Yeah.
because that's what fans are wanting it to. Fans do not want to necessarily be talked at. I think they want to be talked to, kind of person to person.
He got hired, and yeah, like there was like that initial thing, but without there
Mhm.
being a shape to the club in terms of players.
Yeah.
Once players started getting signed, then it was the height of
Mhm.
COVID, and there
Yeah.
wasn't an opportunity to build that relationship, not just with the coach
Mhm.
once he actually had the kind of personalities on his roster that he knew he was going to have. There wasn't that opportunity to do the more fleshed out thing that you can
Mhm.
with a club that isn't just coming into existence, that
Yeah.
actually has players on the roster, that actually has fleshed
Mhm.
out some stuff with a team that has actually practiced with each other
Yeah.
once. Um,
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because I think because at the same time that COVID was starting up, the world was going into its various shells and things like that. And certainly for Josh, who's not somebody who necessarily relishes that sort of like fan and media contact and stuff like that, it's easier to go into that bubble just because that's where everybody was at. And then this was a time where Los Verdes was first forming, and you had Slack and you had Zoom and you had people that were connecting because of that, and fans were really getting a sense of their relationships within that group, and it was new and there was a lot of energy around that, but it was more directed towards what kind of fan experience are we going to bring, and not necessarily connectedness that's happening with the club. The club was definitely a focus, but more of an abstract than, oh, we have actual players, we have these communications with an actual coach. Thinking about how other teams do this, I know that Phil Neville was not particularly popular when he first went to Portland, and they got him in a room with fans to talk. And I think that did help somewhat. I think the way that they exited the playoffs maybe is not going to help. But again, they had the Neville hire, and then they had the whole just show with the DeBella sponsorship, and had
uh-huh.
to punt that about a month in. And then obviously they got Tillamook. That was better. Evander certainly made the team better. But I remember being at Coachella, and I remember like talking to a couple of Timbers fans, and I'm like, yeah, sorry about your coach, sorry about your sponsor. And they just nodded and acknowledged that it was not a fun time to be in Portland
Yeah,
rooting for that team.
I mean, this extended off season for the fan base, for the club, there are
Mhm.
opportunities for a lot of things to get realigned, relationships to get reset, recalibrated, and so on. You know, figuring out, what they're doing with admitting new supporters groups and that sort of thing, is one of
Mhm.
many things on their plate ahead of a year that is going to be a very visible year for the club, where
Mhm.
after what happened in 2023, you did not see Austin players or Austin as a club highlighted and as visible in the MLS season pass series of tiles as you did in
Mhm.
the early part of 2023. When that El Trafico got postponed, all of the
Mhm.
attention went directly to that St. Louis opener that
Yeah.
created momentum for not Austin in not a
Yeah.
great
Yeah.
way. And
Right.
not from players and front office to all the supporters. I feel like there is really great opportunity and eagerness from everybody involved to
Mhm.
get back on the right foot and get used to, look, this is the post-COVID reality that we are all living in.
Mhm.
People are
Yeah.
shorter with each other, things get missed in the nuance of things, and everybody would really very much like to just show up and have a good time, please.
Mhm.
And that's everybody. But yeah, the indication that I get on background is that there's a gigantic amount of energy on top of a gigantic amount of awareness
Mhm.
that people are burned out in so many
Yeah.
different respects. And
Sure. Yeah.
what we have known to be the mystery box of a club may end up, as a result, opening up a little bit in ways that you and I have talked about, really wishing that they
Yeah.
would, and
Mhm.
find ways to make potentially press shy players dispel some of the conspiracy theorizing and rumor mongering and stuff by just checking in with them and hearing them talk more often, even if they don't want to be
Yeah.
interviewed
Right.
necessarily to death. If you feed the fans the right kind of stuff, they don't turn into
Mhm.
trolls. You don't feed the fans, they're going to get grumpy.
Yeah. And again, with Stebas, I don't think that he kind of deals in the same kind of familiar phrasing, we could say, that Josh would tend to rely on. So I think that maybe, again, just in terms of we talk about this kind of idea of emotional intelligence, but also just in terms of being able to articulate things in a way to where it seems like he's thinking and answering rather than in some cases maybe deflecting. Again, with Wolf, sometimes he would definitely engage, but other times, obviously, what he was doing was deflecting. It was reflexive. It was
Talking point
just
based.
essentially, yeah, just stating core principles and not really getting into particular specifics that are germane to the situation, I guess you could say, right? Again, like the whole post Orlando, we share in the blame quote that he
Yeah.
had. I feel, yeah, and again, it'll be interesting to see, okay, what happens? How does this new coach handle like the first really bad moment that happens, right? It might not be on the order of that Orlando match or Violette in 2023 or something along those lines. But there's certainly, it's a 34 game season. This is not a perfect roster yet. Bad moments can still happen next year. So even though there might be some substantial
Hey,
year over year improvement, certainly everybody hopes so.
We might see some Brad Stuver saves against Kevin De Bruyne if San Diego ends up actually making that happen. I wanted to ask you. I wanted to ask you something on the coaching side of things before we jump to player speculation. Do we think Davy Arnaud stays? Do we think we see a big turnover in assistants?
That's a really good question. I feel like there's going to be some helpful institutional knowledge that he would have. I don't know that like Estevez necessarily has like a whole core of assistants that he wants to bring on. So I could certainly see something like that happening, but I don't know if he's going to want to make a clean break from that and have just an all new staff, or if having that kind of tie would be helpful. I do think that the team responded differently with Davey, and I thought that Davey was pretty grounded in his post-match press conference after that last game. And I think that we did get the sense of he knows that like this might have been the only game, but at the same time, like definitely he had this kind of fondness, I think, for the process, the newness of it. He has been an interim before, but didn't seem instantly jaded about the whole process of answering questions after a match, which was nice. So we'll see. I think it'd be great if he stuck around, but I could understand also if Nico's wanting to bring in his own guys. That's typically what coaches want to do, but it might make a certain sort of sense.
Yeah, speaking of that final game, I liked seeing that they had Brett Utley on the sideline as an assistant for that game, clipboarding it or iPadding it, whatever it was. Just
right.
There are some of those kinds of things that I think it would behoove the club to highlight little things like that. That sentiment is a big thing in this community and across the fan base, and it's nice seeing visible body language of people who get along and who like each other and who have been in the trenches with each other and suffered and toiled and prevailed in varying ways. Yeah, it was the vibes of that game were solid, including getting to see some players get minutes who had not gotten minutes in a while.
I know. Yeah. And to see Kolmanic and what he was able to do was interesting because we haven't really seen that level of play out of him in quite a while. This might have arguably been his best appearance in Austin ever.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Maybe. So yeah, I did not expect that. And to his credit, he really showed up in that, which I thought was good because that's a player that I've been wondering about. Yeah, let's go ahead and talk about these new players. I want to do something. So we have Obrian, we have Wolf, we have Heinzike, and we have Rubio that have all been given contract extensions, right? So in the case of some of them, there was a possibility that their option year would not be renewed and that they would be then theoretically on their way or having to renegotiate with the club. But we did ultimately see these renegotiations, right? So everybody on that list is going to be here for at least one more year, guaranteed, and then option years in some of those cases, right? So let's go ahead. I guess, I don't know if we want to do like a 1 to 10 rating on how good we think the extension is, just thinking about not only the player and what he's contributed, but what that kind of signing does for the team in terms of flexibility, in terms of depth, in terms of just creating this kind of positive continuity from at least the previous season. What do you think Obrian was?
I may not be as useful on the number scale. I think those are the fill ratings. I think those have to be the canonical numerical grades here. Right. But I'll give you some research assistant style essay form answers. So Obrian mentioned him earlier as a distressed asset taken on from the Ashes of Frisco who had trouble staying on side. He does not have as much trouble staying on side. He had trouble scoring goals. He ended up scoring a whole bunch of goals. He was a player who had a great deal of potential that for whatever reason just didn't happen at Dallas. And visible improvement over the course of the season. This is a guy who knew that he had to show up and improve and work on things. And look at his stats. He showed
Yeah.
up when this team really needed somebody to show up, and he was the new guy.
Mhm.
And it's
Right,
not
right.
always easy to work into that rotation. He gets along really well with his teammates. He is a positive locker room presence from all indications. Absolutely solid. One of the questions I definitely want to ask, probably on follow up, is what Nico's relationship with Otter is. Was that a
Right.
sporting decision that he did not agree with to
Yeah,
let him
yeah.
go? Or was it
Mhm.
something that was just the fault of the broader sporting organization's plans for him at
Mhm.
Dallas? And I would be shocked if they're not expecting to be asked about this. And I hope they're prepared
Mhm.
to have some sort of an answer. And if there is relationship repair to be done, I'm brought back to one of the various things that I've read about Nico, where when he was with the men's national team as an assistant, he was apparently going above and beyond with Yunus Musa and
Mhm.
giving him advice, being available to him, helping him get acclimated in his club life with pointers and thoughts and things that
Right.
an assistant for a national team doesn't generally do that kind of stuff. The word being that, as some of our colleagues told you by email, that Nico is big on player relationships. I'd be curious to hear what his estimation of that relationship with Hot Air is.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
maybe it is not as dire as people might necessarily assume,
Mhm.
and it will be a happy reunion. But maybe there are fences to be mended. Who knows?
Yeah, no, that'll be interesting. I mean, I anticipate that's going to be something that gets asked about on Tuesday. You will be there repping ready all day. Maybe ask about that if nobody else
Oh,
does, but of
it's on my
course.
list. It's on my list.
Okay, good, good,
I'm
good.
putting it
Yeah.
out
So
there already, so people know what my notes look like. Steal them if you wish.
that's awesome. Yeah. Okay. So I would give this an 8. I think they still need to maybe get another starting winger. I don't know
Hmm.
that Obrian is quite that caliber. I think he is a rotational starter. He had 11 goal contributions this year, same as last year. But again, thinking about what the team did in its entirety, I think that having those goal contributions was particularly important just because you really had a lot of people on the team that were struggling to score. And he is somebody that like did step up and contribute that way. I do think that if he gets those sort of minutes that another kind of couple of years of double digit goal contributions is not out of the question. But again, this kind of idea, I think where it's going to ultimately pan out is okay, is Obrian the starting winger most of the time with Bukri, or is he like a 30-minute super sub and they get another kind of higher caliber winger to pair with Bukri as the starter for a good chunk of the season? So I do think that's something that still needs to be figured out. But yeah, certainly for getting somebody from the reentry draft. And again, like we've talked about, I think Roto did really want him, but also nudged up to the number 1 position, I think just because he could and wanted to show off a little bit. I don't think he necessarily needed to do that. I think Obrian still would have been available if they
Yeah.
had their pick a little bit further down. But I thought that it was really pretty amusing that they jumped up and grabbed that number 1 to show, yes, we are really going to do something in this reentry draft and nobody can stop us now. And I'm sure that created some kind of intrigue about, okay, who's it going to be? Thought it might have been Santiago Arias, but no, it was Obrian.
I think that
I think overall it worked out.
in my head, I think that show of force is partly it was a statement to the player of, this is how much we prioritize you.
Yeah,
This is how
yeah.
big a deal you
Mhm.
are. You're
Right, right.
incredible. You're amazing. We believe in you.
Mm.
We're going
Yeah,
to make sure that you're treated well. You come here.
yeah.
We're going to take care of you. Just perform for us
You're
or
our
you
number 1
die.
pick in this weird context, but it's still
Yes.
number 1, even though it's
Yeah.
weird. All right.
Yeah.
Owen Wolf, what do we think here?
Look, I have been Team Owen Wolf for quite a while, and incredibly talented. That the effortlessness of that late season goal of his,
Against
the
Toronto, yeah.
against Toronto, that calm precision,
Mhm.
that take the leash off the wolf and let's see what happens.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the way that I feel about it. And
Mhm.
I am very bullish on him being loosed from being under the yoke of his dad
Yeah.
is something that is going to be positive for his career, not just because
Mhm.
now people can
Yeah.
stop mentioning his dad's name in concert with literally everything that he does due
Mhm.
to proximity. Very talented guy that puts in the yeoman's shift wherever he gets deployed across the field. When
Mhm.
the roster
Yeah.
was shortest, he was there. John Gallagher was there.
Mhm.
They
Yeah.
were the multi duty guys that really put in the shift, even if they were not the ideal person to be placed in those given positions, that they are there for the team. They're there for the team dynamic. Incredibly talented player who will be useful whether he ends up working great in Nico's system or he ends up being an incredible profit machine selling him off to Europe.
Some things I'm curious about. First of all, is this preparatory for moving him on to a European destination, or is he really choosing at this point to have a long MLS career, which I think he certainly could do? I think Danny might have the flashier career out of the two. There might be more individual accolades along the way, but I do think that Owen has the potential to be more consistent and maybe more, I don't know if durable is the right word, but I think I could see Owen being this player that could have a nice, consistent MLS career that would span, especially at his age. I could see him going 15 years easily, given what he's already done. Yeah, and again, that idea, I think Estevez as a hire is pretty interesting from this perspective, that it is someone who is not going to be completely foreign to Owen because they're from that same coaching tree. There are going to be some things that are in common, but at the same time, it is a different voice. And just seeing, okay, how can he develop with different kind of coaching input with a different style? And again, just the question of, okay, is he still going to be the Swiss Army knife? Is he going to be bouncing around between 4 different positions, or is he going to really stick and focus on something, right? Is he going to be a central midfielder? Is he going to be a winger? What is it that Owen Wolff ultimately is that he's going to be best at? And can Estevez be the coach to really figure that out and unlock that? So
Yeah,
I think this is 8, but potential to be as high as a 9. I mean, I do think that when you have somebody that versatile in the system that is developing, that is on a certain level at this young age and has the potential to ramp up even more in the next couple of years, I think it's good. Again, I don't understand the Owen hate out there. Yes, okay, I understand the Owen hate out there. I just don't agree with the Owen hate that's out there.
Yeah, you get it, but you don't comprehend it. That's the thing. It defies some logic. Up next, Brendan Hines-Ike.
Yeah. What do you think? Let's get your...
Brendan Hines-Ike is one of the best acquisitions in club history, if you ask me.
Okay.
He goes hard.
That's a strong statement. Okay.
He is one of the best pickups. I'm not talking about players that started with the club, that kind of thing. Looking at picking up somebody in a position where they need depth, who is not just as good, but he is the best center back on the team. And I don't think that we've seen enough from Svatok for me to feel like I'm casting him aside. Okay. But the production that we saw from him overall over the course of the season, having to carry a bit of a heavy load at times, he kept the back line solid more than I really feel like we've seen it since 2022. And he is responsive to his fellow teammates. He acknowledges his screw ups and immediately gets right back in the dirt. Yeah. He is unflappable when it comes to that stuff. He screws something up, he just keeps going.
Yeah. So to start with, he is a consummate professional. He's a veteran. He's a leader. He does things the right way. He's very principled. Like, all that stuff is fantastic. I think that's really good. And again, I think he got hard done by DC, right? I don't understand why he got cut necessarily. I think to get him on that number and to get that center back depth at a time where that was really needed because they didn't want to repeat what happened in 23. Yeah, I thought it was good. I give this a 7 or 8. I still think that Svatok is going to be the best center back on this team in the coming year. I think that he's there already. It's just needing to ramp up a little bit more and get used to things because he is still relatively new. I'm concerned about otherwise what's happening with center back. I don't know what the whole Cascante said Instagram athlete and not Austin FC player thing is all about. I don't know what's going on with Vicenen and his whole kind of shutdown. I don't know if Hedges is going to be extended on the number that he's at. I guess it depends. If Vicenen is going, then I think they might keep Hedges just because they're going to need somebody who's familiar. But again, familiar with the system. It's a new system. It's different, but also there is that kind of tie that Hedges has been coached by Estevez. Yeah. So I mean,
this was the position I played, and I'm as an adult very short for a center back. But like my familiarity with it, you have to have cohesiveness among your backline guys. They don't just have to be good; they have to be good together. And that's one of the things that Gabrielson was very
Mhm.
good at, keeping the
Yeah.
guys together. And Heinz
Mhm.
is very much that kind of stabilizing force. At least he
Yeah.
has been over the course of this season. And to your point about the number they got him on, I think that's one of the reasons that I rate this so highly as such a
Yeah.
crucial thing, because dealing with a salary cap league, you have to factor that in there. Not as much as
Mhm.
like getting in the weeds of arguing, this guy's making too much money or that guy's too much money, because you can argue that all these guys made too much money. But
Right.
when you look at the strategic value of what he represents
Mhm.
and
Right.
how he fits into that roster structure, salary wise, one of the best deals, one of the best pickups in
Right.
club history, not just based on his performance, but for how much they're spending on him.
Yeah.
That to me is what completes that. And early
Yeah.
on in his tenure here, when he talked to us at one of the midweek pressers, he just voluntarily went real hard talking about how the high performance and conditioning staff here are better than any club he's ever been at,
Mhm.
very prominently. And that makes me think that may have been part of the issue at
Right.
DC, was that
Yeah.
as an organization, they did not prioritize health and safety and that kind of thing as much as some
Right.
players would like. And that isn't players being whiny babies or something. It's
Mhm.
them going, look, if we're not well taken care of, if we are not, if we are played, until our bones grind to dust, then sorry, we're not going to be available. Like, I'm not a robot. And I
Yeah.
feel like that is part of what has resulted in him thriving here, is
Yeah.
something that you don't see that outside of negotiations with players, where Roto's telling them how incredibly great of care they're going to get. And hey, those facilities at Audi, yeah, they're a thing of the past. You're looking at state of the art everything. It's brand new, it's
Right.
fresh, and that's a very good thing.
With his age and with his injury history as well, there is that kind of concern about him and his health and all that. And again, yeah, also he played in DC 22 and 23. He started at DC under Hernan Losada, who was not necessarily a player favorite. And
No,
there were kind of
no.
some concerns about just his management of just players. And it wasn't like Gabriel Heinz levels of deprivation, but there were certainly, yeah, there's maybe a feeling that Austin is a little more friendly to players and their kind of overall well-being than things that he might have experienced in his past, we shall say. All right, and then Diego Rubio.
Diego Rubio, the master of the dark arts, the
Hmm.
dark art tip of the spear. I've been criticized for how soft of a spot in my heart that I have for both Diego Rubio
Hmm.
and Giassi Zardes. I believe they are both very capable players. They're very good
Hmm.
players. They are good parts of this roster that is missing pieces that would
Hmm.
make them both look better. Having them do less heavy lifting of a type that those guys, the age of their knees, just physically can't do anymore.
Right.
If they didn't have to do that kind of heavy lifting, both solid guys, very solid locker room presences. Rubio and the other South American dudes get along incredibly well, thick as thieves.
Hmm.
That kind of dynamic stuff is important. And on the field, everything that people liked about Felipe, Diego does from the front, and
Right.
he is a disruptive force to every back line he comes anywhere near. Is he finishing? Is he scoring the goals? Nah, that's a problem. It's a big problem, but if he is creating those opportunities for the guys who are
Hmm.
there, if he
Yeah.
is very much playing, he is transitioning from being a traditional nine to a false nine, then there is definitely value there. And I feel
Yeah.
like as the roster filled in, as frustrated as he may have been to not start in some formations where they didn't really start with a nine, or starting and then being subbed off when he was gassed and should have known that he was gassed, but just for whatever reason got subbed off, because if there's no gas left in the tank, car ain't going to drive. People were more bullish on him earlier in the season than toward the end. But I think that his stabilizing presence, not just in the locker room, but on the field, is
Hmm.
something that with other roster moves that will definitely happen in the winter, he is a valuable part of this group where there was so much turnover last season. Granted, we're expecting a fair amount of turnover this season. It's
Yeah.
not going to be as much. It's not going to be the kind of fire sale bloodletting, just wholesale getting rid of tons and tons of guys.
Hmm.
Um, And I feel like him being on a 1 year with an option is totally reasonable. Totally reasonable.
Yeah. I guess it really depends on what they're doing otherwise with striker. If the
Uh-huh.
intention is to keep both Rubio and Zardes, then that really concerns me because again, you have 7 goals between the two. You have 64 years between the two. They're not getting younger. Rubio 2 years ago, he was 16 goal, 7 assist player. I don't think he's going to get remotely close to that again.
Yeah.
And I know that he's being asked to do some different stuff now. And again, if he is like more of a playmaking forward, if he is getting wingers and Driussi involved in scoring. And again, we saw, early in the season, we saw some potential for that. We saw some really good things in the Galaxy game in April in Austin. We saw goals being scored at the start of the year, but there was just this kind of drop off. And my concern, yeah, so if he's on a 1-1, then he's more motivated in 2025 to perform just because he knows that option year is there and that this could be it if he doesn't show himself to be productive. But what this is telling me is that first of all, there's got to be a younger, more prolific striker that's coming in to start because clearly Rubio and Zardes can't really be
Mm-hmm.
an everyday starter and have this team succeed because you just do need production from a striker, period. Even though Josh had talked about it's just one guy and everybody else needs to score too. But if you have a 15 to 20 goal striker on your team, that does make a big difference. It doesn't necessarily get you to the playoffs. Just ask DC, which has the Golden Boot winner, and they're not in the playoffs, but it does help a whole bunch. My thought is that with Rubio being renewed, this might mean that Zardes is the buyout candidate for 25. We might see him on the way out, or
Or
it's going to be,
or they don't protect him and San Diego take him.
but I don't think San Diego would take him. Is the thing. Yeah, and we'll talk about that. Again, I think there's an interesting thought exercise of do you leave Driussi unprotected on the number that he's on, the production that he's on, and maybe dare San Diego to see what they'll do. But I also think that, again, with this hire and everything, the kind of idea is that Driussi can be built back up.
Yeah. There's some
But again,
stabilizing forces coming into play.
yeah, theoretically. Yeah, again, that's going to be one of the big questions to me. But yeah, but again, I think if you have Rubio and Zardes that are still remaining on your roster, then yes, you need to have a primate striker, preferably somebody DP level that's going to come in, and then you have those two guys spell as super subs. You can't really rely on them as everyday starters, I think, at this point in their career. Or you're dislodging Zardes with the buyout, you're freeing up $1 million, and maybe it's just Rubio and Zardes, their production's on the same wavelength. Rubio's less expensive. You can do other things with the salary that you're going to get back if you buy him out and you don't have that $1 million salary on the books. But again, yeah, right now to me, it's a 4. Like, I don't love the move. I think Diego is great. I love the energy that he brings. I was really thrilled to see what he was doing in the early part of the season. I wish that he would get that mojo back, and I would hope for a full season of that. And he deserves that as a human being, but I'm really concerned about the production at that position. And I don't see going into the season with Rubio and Zardes again as your only two strikers being anywhere remotely near successful. I
completely
don't
agree.
think it works.
Yeah. For me, the thing with Rubio is I see him, I'm thinking about a different kind of numerical scale or just quantitative or production-based prediction to make here. I feel like Rubio is one of the players best situated to see the new coach having a transformative effect on his ability to produce, because it really did feel like he was bumping right up against the incredibly tight formalism of the Wolf system, where he was doing as he was told. But the top thing, and there are definitely tactics nerds who are way more conversant about this stuff than me, but from where I was sitting, the thing that bugged me the most about Wolf Ball was that it really expected all these players to be robots. And as much as people would make fun of Zardes for being an old man with creaky knees who couldn't keep up, I was glad that they were throwing us the stats of that guy covering more ground than anybody else on the pitch in multiple games. And it's great that he's capable of doing that, but it would maybe be better if he weren't being run all out of gas doing unproductive stuff. So I don't know, maybe that possibility is going to be there for Zardes too. maybe the Roto has hit the upward limit of how much he can splash out on things like buyouts, where tactically,
Yeah.
if money were not an issue, the notion of buying him out might seem like the sound thing to do to open up salary cap, but you're still having to
Mhm.
pay all that money out for the rest of that
Yeah.
contract. The question is, do you see what you can get out of Zardes under a new system, under a new coach,
Mhm.
and let it ride for half a season and then revisit it in the summer? But I think to your
Yeah.
point, going into next season, I cannot possibly fathom there not being a good enough younger striker somewhere on the market that they can't bring
Mhm.
in the winter, even though
Yeah.
Europe and blah, 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 blah. There's got to be options. So, yeah,
Mhm.
I feel like your rating of Rubio at a 4 is very reasonable. And I
Mhm.
think that he has a very good opportunity to clown that number that you just gave him, sir.
I-
But
again,
hey,
and
the
this is
results have to speak to it.
yeah, and again, this is assessing it based on where it is right now and what the roster looks like in its current configuration. Obviously,
Mhm.
there are other pieces that are going to move. And again, also, I think Zardes is a nice guy. I have really respected the career that he's had in MLS and with the US national team and all that. But again, if you are only getting 3 goals from a striker that you're paying $1 million, that is not a great investment. That's not good production for MLS. Like when you are paying a player $1 million a year, that player has to contribute something bigger than that person
Bigger
is.
than
And again, the same thing. You have O'Brien, who is on what I think 550,000, I want to say, and then you have Driussi on 6 million, and obviously with DPs and salary cap and stuff like that, it's not that much of a hit, but he is. Yeah, this is interesting. The MLS player salary stuff came out this last week,
yeah.
and I think so. So Messi obviously makes a cajillion dollars, and in Sydney for Toronto makes a cajillion dollars. So in terms of proportions of highest paid player, having a percentage of the team's overall salary budget, like Messi for Miami is like number one on the list. Like he makes proportionally the most money of anybody on that team. Insigne is second, and then Driussi is third. So Driussi is making something like I think 38% of the Austin FC salary. He had the same number of goals. O'Brien actually had more goal contributions. So that is, to me, very problematic. You have to get production out of your DPs, which was the whole Rigoni thing, and you have to get production out of that whole top end of your salary, those TAM players.
So I guess real quick, I pulled up on Transfer Market the expiring contracts, and
Yeah.
I figured we could run through that list that by this time next week we could know completely different things about this. So you wrote this class of 2024 piece about all the different option years and
Yeah.
people that some of whom have already been addressed by having their contracts renewed. I
Right.
I
Three of
pulled
them.
up, yeah, I pulled up Transfer Market's list, and there are a couple of notable things that I think we can jump through, rattle through. Danny Pereira is at
Sure.
the top of the list. Roto already told us he's coming back. He will play for this team next year,
Right.
in advance of actually, signing whatever needs to be signed.
They'll
Ring,
definitely, yeah, they'll extend. Yeah,
I'll
they'll
extend.
extend Pereira. They'll do the option year. Yeah, actually Friday, what I was expecting was going to be like a new Pereira contract, but we got a coach instead. So I kind
Slightly
of
bigger
expected
news.
that might happen next week. Yeah.
Alex Ring
Yes and no.
has
Okay.
Alex Ring's got one club option year. Do you think that happens?
Mhm. Again, yeah, this is the thing I keep bringing up. Like he got auto renewed for 24. It's very possible that given that was still the same contract that he's already been auto renewed for 25, but he's not talking about it like that. He's talking about it like his agent and the team are talking. So that's what he's mentioned. I don't know if he's doing that just to be coy or if indeed there is a question about whether or not he'll return. I think if he does return and they negotiate something, they've obviously got to do it on a smaller number, and I don't know what he would necessarily settle for. I don't know if he feels like he could maybe, make more than Austin would offer him in that situation somewhere else, be it here, somewhere in MLS, or I thought Bundesliga might be an interesting place for him
Hmm.
to transition to, just because he has played there before, and maybe there is a team that would see his value there and that would get him closer to Finland. But I don't exactly know that. Again, he is getting older, but at the same time, there are some things that he does very well still at this point in his career. But there are other things that he doesn't do as well. I have the whole pros and cons thing with him. This this is a perplexing question. Again, I think he's really stepped up big this year, in terms of not only giving what he does on the field, but also in terms of regaining the captaincy and creating that kind of leadership in what's been a pretty challenging season for everybody. I don't know, again, first of all, if this thing has already been decided by an auto renew, and I don't know that necessarily it makes the most sense for him to have an option year renewed by the club. They probably do need to remake the midfield a little bit, and that seems like one area where they would want to do that, but it's hard to say. I don't know. What do you think?
I feel like there is definitely interest from his side to make something
Mhm.
work. He's said very
Sure.
clearly that he does want to stay. And I
Yeah.
feel like even if it is, on a lower number, I feel like he is incentivized to figure it out, make it work. And he's another player like Rubio, who I think,
Mhm.
and Pereira for that matter, who I think could thrive under different tactics, different coaching,
Yeah.
knowing that there was a fractious relationship between him and Wolf. So let's jump between the sticks for a second. Talk about Matt
Okay, sure.
Bersano. Matt Bersano, 0 minutes, spent a lot more time renovating houses than playing, it seemed.
Mm.
I think he's definitely gone. And if anything,
Yeah.
maybe they give Aaron Cervantes a first team contract and have him continue to play with the second team to keep getting
Yeah.
minutes
Yeah.
in the second
Yeah.
position.
Yeah, as soon as they signed Cleveland, became superfluous just because he was clearly the backup, and Cleveland is clearly better than him by all the metrics. Again, Bersano, nice guy. Definitely, I think, contributes in practice, but yeah, he hasn't really had that much experience in MLS playing. He's been a backup keeper his whole career, and you don't need to have two backup keepers. Even if you have one on a supplemental level, it doesn't make sense to have somebody that senior in that kind of role where that person's like absolutely never going to see the field.
Mentioning the second team, let's talk about the CJ Jimmy connection because Jimmy's contract expires. There's a 2 year club option on it. And
Mhm.
CJ's just plain expires as far as
Yeah.
transfer market thinks, and there isn't a club option on it. It feels to me like they've got to pick both of these guys back up.
With Jimmy Bryant, I think the thing that needs to happen is that he needs to still develop on the second team, but he can take up a supplemental spot as a first team player. He can occasionally spell when they need severe winger depth, which again, I wonder about how often they would actually use that. And so I do think that it makes sense to re-sign him in the zone that he's in. Again, you have a 30-player roster for that reason. So Fodry is actually under contract through 25, and then his option years for 26 and 27.
Okay. All
And
right.
I'm trying to sort this out with Cam. We're trying to figure out there's some weird thing about like your roster position and whether or not you are protected in the expansion draft by virtue of being a Generation Adidas player. I think it's going to turn out that Fodry is automatically protected. I think if he is not for whatever reason, if there is indeed something, it has to do with your supplemental roster spot 21st through 24th, 25th through 28th. It is really MLS roster rule in the
Yeah.
weeds, confusing as all get out. But I think if he's not protected, I think San Diego would be interested in getting him as a hometown player, and I think
Yeah.
that they might make some sort of deal in that case to maybe avoid getting another player snatched up if they did that as like a gesture of goodwill. But I think if he's protected, then yeah, they are going to keep him and they are going to
Right.
try to develop him.
And I
I could also see like keeping him around for one more year and then maybe not picking up his option year or extending him and then just moving him to San Diego. I feel like if he ended up at San Diego, he would not mind that at all. But I think he also likes being at Austin. I don't know if he necessarily likes the ping ponging back between the first and second team.
Yeah, the reason I brought him up, assuming that transfer market was wrong, feeling in my bones that transfer market was wrong, is because like him and Jimmy connecting, knowing that they are roommates, that they connect so well. I feel
Yeah.
like he may eventually want to move to San Diego. I don't know that he necessarily wants to move away from the Austin system because when you are connecting well with your partner on the opposite wing, that's a thing that you got to build up to. And if they're getting more comfortable, and honestly, they're playing the second team together was glorious toward the end of that
Mhm.
season. They really figured
Right.
it out. They really locked in together. I feel like there's probably interest from the player in sticking around and nothing against John Gallagher, but if you have someone
Mhm.
who is more naturally comfortable as a left winger in Fodre, even if it is a matter of fighting for the spot as to
Right.
who starts. It would be interesting to see this young guy who I feel like maybe got in trouble for hyping up the crowd at Q2 because his coach didn't like that. Seeing what that guy can do with a bit more of the freedom that I feel like he has when he plays with the second team than the first. I think that's an interesting thing. I noticed Rodrigo
Mhm.
Rios from the first team coaching staff at just some random Austin FC2 game, just watching the
Yeah.
whole game. And they have to be looking at these developmental players and going, how, especially the ones that have first team contracts, how can they fit into what the needs are?
Yeah.
And look, if San Diego really wants him and wants to pony up the money for him, and
Mhm.
I don't see losing him in the offseason as something that is going to cause a critical failure or something.
I could theoretically, since they are an expansion team, I could see that there would be more minutes possible for Fodry, but
Yeah,
also Chucky is one of their starting wingers now. That's already taken. You do already have some kind of appreciable winger play happening there already by virtue of just that one signing. Again, if they get De Bruyne, like that's
that's
your midfield settled,
there
and
you go.
I don't know. Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you know what?
So it
Bring
could be
second
hard to get
stringer.
minutes there too.
Yeah,
Yeah. Anybody else you want to visit?
I think we've talked to death that it's got to be Coach Hector next season. We've got to
Yep.
be looking at an Austin hero, Austin legend sent off
Mhm.
in grand fashion, directly to the
Yeah.
touchline. And the only other guys that we got here, we got Hedges, who we already talked about a little bit earlier, Finley,
Mhm.
Valencia.
Yeah.
Mm,
Valencia, I think, is gone. I think he's
he's got
back
to
to
be
South
gone.
America. Finley maybe takes on that kind of Hector role this year. I think it depends on what they decide, just numbers wise. Finley does have the option year, so they could just do the option year and then wonder and revisit next year whether or not they want to extend them beyond that. Again, with a lot of these players that we saw this last week, we did see players that, in some cases, with Heinz Ike and with Rubio, where they did have to decide, okay, are we just going to do that option year and then go from there, or are we going to extend? And they extended in both cases by a year. So I do think that something could be similarly in the works. But again, I don't know how many appreciably good years Finley has left, and
Yeah.
you saw him reduced in his role this past year, and I don't know if that's just like Josh's decisions and Estevez would see it differently, or if it is indeed just he is coming near the end of his playing career. Again, it's father time comes for us all, right? So, and I
Yeah.
think if he did not stay with the club, I think that that would be an understandable personnel decision. I think from a veteran leadership perspective, I think it behooves the team to keep him here just for that. But and again, you have the roster spots where you could do that, especially if you can somehow get him on a supplemental in a new contract, and that it's not as egregious to the roster makeup. But they do have to get younger at that position, though, as well, is the other consideration.
The theory that I've got going on both Finley and Hedges is that they are both
Mhm.
guys with options and they are
Yeah.
both on enough money that I feel like Roto is going to want to negotiate that yearly spend down on both of them if he is going to
Mhm.
keep them. And
Yeah.
it's entirely contingent on their agents playing
Yeah.
ball and
And that's the
accepting.
trade-off, right?
Yeah.
So either you stay on at this lesser salary or we don't take your option year and you try your luck in the open market.
Yeah, that's to me that's what it is. I see them
Mhm.
going one more contract year with an option
Mhm.
on Finley and with Hedges two more guaranteed years with an option.
Yeah. I
You
also
know.
think that depends on what else Roto's doing with center back
Yeah,
and
completely agree.
if he's needed for depth, or again, if they only need four center backs and because Conte really isn't going anywhere and Bison and like that gets mended, then maybe Hedges is the odd guy out in that case.
Yeah, I think Vicenen is more a health thing than they're just
Mhm.
unhappy with him. I think he came back
Right.
from that injury not all the way
Mhm. Yeah.
100%. And
Mhm.
re-aggravation of that injury, look,
Mhm.
they've got him under contract and they are behooved to make sure that they
Mhm.
don't break their lucky
Yeah.
Scandinavian center back.
Yeah, and it's a tough injury, and it's again, he's been a little injury prone in his time here. That
Mhm.
could be the other thing too. Maybe they know that they can't necessarily rely on him health wise, but perhaps if he really rests and gets away from the game and gets back to Europe, maybe there's a trajectory for him there that there wouldn't be here.
But yeah, so there's our full roster speculation in advance of being proven brilliantly correct or horribly wrong about any number of different things.
Do you think we're going to get another 4 signings this week?
Maybe, honestly.
Yeah.
I think the splash zone of Tuesday, they're going to let the
Mhm.
press conference and the fan meet and greet be what it is.
Yeah.
But I
Sure.
I would
That'll be
be
the story. Yeah.
I would be surprised if we don't get another advent calendar door open on Monday. As much as Roto hedged, not to make a
Mhm.
hedges in joke, as much as he hedged about, I think I know mostly what I want to do in terms of all these decisions. He's got the coach now. I doubt that that actually held up what his plans were. I think that hedge was much more
Right.
about not tipping the hand that, yeah, we're basically just dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's on Estevez' contract. We've known he was the guy for a while. It just took Josh forever to get bounced out of the playoffs. It feels to me like it was really much more about
Yeah.
he's been in
Right.
conversation with Estevez about these decisions. It's not now they've hired
Right.
Estevez and he's going to consult on these last ones. They've made all the decisions. They are padding them out in the
Right.
way that they want to. And
Mhm.
whatever last lingering conversations there are, just look at the list. It's the ones that have club option deals that they obviously want to negotiate down. That's
Right.
really what it comes down to. And then
Mhm.
the prestige thing of the team's first ever captain, provided that deal got done, and Danny Pereira, the team's show pony, for lack of a better term.
All right. We have made up for not recording in a few weeks by recording a whole lot right now. So thanks for sticking with us. If you have indeed stuck with us, and if you have not, then you won't be hearing this. So
People,
thank you. Thank you
people
for
who
being
don't
here.
stick with us, they're the real emergency. That's faithlessness that we can't stand.
All right. We will see you at some point in the near future with more news. Definitely gonna talk about this press conference, what we learn, and go from there. Try to figure out what the roster is going to look like, what things get answered, and then what questions will still remain.